I didn't arrive at the senior center expecting anything out of the ordinary to happen, because my reason for being there was so small and practical that it barely registered as an event at all. Just another stop folded into an already busy day, a simple errand on behalf of a family member who needed paperwork dropped off as signatures confirmed, the kind of task that usually takes 10 minutes and leaves no memory behind once it's done. And that ordinariness was exactly why the situation that followed felt so surreal, as if the world had decided to pause and zoom in on a moment that never deserved attention in the first place. The senior center sat quietly in its usual place, a low brick building softened by time and familiarity, bordered by a small park on one side and a medical office on the other. Its parking lot modest and unassuming, laid out in a simple grid with faded white lines and a handful of trees along the edge that had been there long enough to earn their space, their branches wide and generous, casting long shadows that broke up the harsh glare of the late morning sun. And as I pulled into the lot, the first thing I noticed was how empty it was, with plenty of open spaces scattered throughout, most of them fully exposed to the heat, shimmering slightly as the sun reflected off the asphalt. Without overthinking it, I steered toward one of the shaded spots near the edge of the lot, not because I was trying to claim something special or take anything away from anyone else, but simply because the shade was there and the space was open. And after parking, I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, enjoying the brief relief from the heat as I gathered the papers from the passenger seat, double-checking names and dates. My mind already focused on what I needed to say inside and how quickly I could get back on the road. I had barely opened my door when I sensed someone nearby. That subtle awareness you get when another person enters your personal space, with intention rather than coincidence. And when I looked up, I saw a woman standing a few feet away, her posture stiff, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her gaze fixed directly on me in a way that didn't feel curious or friendly, but rather evaluative, as if she were measuring me against some internal standard I hadn't agreed to participate in. "You can't park there," she said, without greeting or hesitation, her tone firm and sharp, the kind of voice that expects immediate compliance. For a moment, I genuinely thought I misunderstood her, so I glanced around the lot, looking for signs or markings I might have missed, reserved symbols, painted warnings, anything that would explain her certainty, but there was nothing. Just the same faded lines and sun-worn asphalt as every other space. And when I looked back at her, I asked calmly, "Why not?" She tightened her jaw slightly. "Those shaded spots are for seniors." I paused, surprised by the confidence with which she stated something that clearly wasn't posted anywhere, and replied, "I don't see any sign saying that." Her eyes narrowed. "They don't need a sign. It's understood." "Understood by who?" I asked, not sarcastically, but genuinely trying to understand the role she seemed to be enforcing. She sighed sharply, as if I were deliberately being difficult. "This is a senior center. Young people shouldn't be taking the good spots. I'm here for senior center business," I said, holding up the folder in my hand. "I'll only be inside for a few minutes." That should have been enough, or at least it would have been for someone interested in reason. But instead of backing down or even softening her tone, she leaned forward slightly, invading my space, and said, "That doesn't matter. You need to move your car." Something in her certainty rubbed against something in me. Not anger exactly, but a quiet resistance to the idea that legality and courtesy could be rewritten on the spot by whoever felt entitled to do so. And I replied evenly, "I'm parked legally, and I'm not moving." The words had barely left my mouth when her expression changed, shifting from irritation to something colder and more deliberate, and without another word, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen with practiced ease, lifting it to her ear as if this were a step she'd taken before. "Hello," she said, her voice suddenly calm and controlled. "I'd like to report someone trespassing at the senior center parking lot." My stomach dropped in a way that felt disproportionate to the situation, but impossible to ignore, because no matter how ridiculous the accusation was, the involvement of emergency services instantly raised the stakes. And I stepped fully out of the car, disbelief flooding my face as I said, "Are you seriously calling 911 because I parked in the shade?" She covered the phone briefly and looked at me with a glare that felt more personal than the situation warranted. "You should have listened." I took a step back, hands visible, papers still clutched loosely at my side. And as she continued speaking, I could hear how she framed the narrative, describing me as disrespectful, uncooperative, and disruptive, implying intent where there was none. And it dawned on me that once someone decides to involve authority, the truth becomes less about what actually happened and more about whose Story sounds more convincing. People began to notice. The quiet routine of the senior center disrupted by the tension hanging in the air. A man exiting the building slowed his pace. A woman near the entrance paused mid-conversation, eyes flicking between us, but no one stepped in. Because conflict has a way of isolating those involved, turning spectators into silent observers unwilling to risk becoming part of the problem. The police arrived sooner than I expected. A cruiser rolling into the lot with its lights briefly flashing before turning off, and the woman straightened immediately, her posture shifting into something almost triumphant as she waved them over, launching into her account before they'd even asked a question, pointing at my car, then at me, repeating her claim that I'd parked in a senior-only space and refused to move when confronted. One of the officers listened quietly, then looked down at the parking lot markings, scanning the area with a trained, neutral eye, before asking her, "Ma'am, where are the senior-only parking signs?" She hesitated, just for a moment. "They don't have signs, but everyone knows." The officer nodded slowly, then turned to me. "Why are you here today?" "I'm dropping off paperwork for a family member," I said calmly. I parked in an open, unmarked space. The officers exchanged a brief glance, the kind that communicated understanding without words. And then one of them explained patiently, but firmly, that there were no parking violations, that shaded spaces were not reserved by default, and that calling 911 for a parking disagreement was not an appropriate use of emergency services. His tone professional, but unmistakably final. The woman's face flushed, her confidence deflating as the authority she'd summoned failed to support her version of events, and she crossed her arms tightly, muttering about respect and how things used to be, but there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the disruption she'd caused. Just a stiff retreat as she turned and walked back toward the building, her earlier certainty replaced by visible frustration. The officers checked in with me briefly, asking if I was okay, apologizing for the inconvenience. And then they left, the cruiser disappearing back onto the road as quickly as it had arrived, and the parking lot slowly exhaled, returning to its quiet, ordinary rhythm as if nothing had happened at all. I stood there for a moment longer, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity, thinking about how easily entitlement can masquerade as concern, how quickly someone's personal expectations can turn into accusations, and how unsettling it is to realize that something as simple as choosing a shaded parking spot can be interpreted as a moral failing by someone determined to police the world around them. I went inside, completed my errand, and returned to my car, driving away without incident. But the experience stayed with me, not because it was dramatic or dangerous, but because it was such a sharp reminder of how fragile ordinary interactions can be when someone decides that their version of courtesy is enforceable law. And now, every time I pull into a parking lot, I find myself more aware of the unspoken rules people invent, the assumptions they make, and the way some individuals believe their preferences grant them authority over strangers. And I still park in the shade when it's available, not out of defiance, but because comfort isn't a crime. Legality doesn't require permission, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand calmly in your truth, even when someone else insists you don't belong.